By the time Harold Turner's pickup rolled into the auction yard, most of the good tractors were already gone. The clean machines had sold first. Tractors with fresh paint, tractors with working engines, tractors a farmer could drive onto a trailer without needing chains, a winch, and 3 men pushing from behind. What remained sat along the far edge of the field, machines nobody wanted, and that was exactly where Harold went. He was 70 years old, 5 years into retirement, and already famous around the county for one strange habit. He bought dead tractors, not old tractors that could still work, dead ones, machines with cracked blocks, missing wheels, burned wiring, frozen transmissions, tractors that had spent 20 years sinking into weeds behind barns. That morning, Harold stopped in front of the worst one on the lot. Its hood was crooked. One rear tire had collapsed into the mud. Rust covered the body so completely that the original paint was visible only in narrow strips beneath old grease. The auctioneer glanced at it, then at the crowd. "Who'll give me 300? Silence. 250? Someone laughed. 200? Still nothing. A man near the back called out, "Just sell it by the pound." More laughter. Harold stepped closer. He did not look at the tires. He did not look at the faded paint. He leaned beneath the frame and studied the machine in silence. Then he stood, raised one hand. "I'll take it." The crowd turned. A few men recognized him immediately. One shook his head. "There goes Harold again." Another laughed. "He's not buying tractors anymore. He's buying rust." Harold heard him. He said nothing. The auctioneer dropped the hammer. Sold. Less than an hour later, Harold chained the tractor to a trailer and pulled away, while men at the auction yard were still joking about what his property must look like by now. They were not wrong about that part. Behind Harold's small workshop sat rows of dead machinery, dozens of tractors, some without engines, some without hoods, some little more than frames resting on flat tires. From the road, the property looked like a graveyard built from iron. Neighbors called it Harold's junk farm. His own son once stood beside him, staring across the yard, and asked, "Dad, what exactly are you planning to do with all this?" Harold looked at the rows of rusting machines, then smiled. "Use it." That answer made no sense to anyone. Harold had spent 43 years repairing farm equipment before retiring at 65. People expected him to fish, garden, sleep late, maybe sit on the porch with coffee and complain about the weather. Instead, only months after retirement, he began driving county roads, looking for tractors other people had stopped seeing. He found them beside collapsing barns, under trees, behind machine sheds, half buried in grass. At auctions where bidders walked past without slowing down, some cost him only a few $100s. Others were so badly seized that they had to be dragged onto trailers. Harold kept buying them, and he never tried to restore a single one. That was the part people found strangest. Every morning, he opened his workshop before sunrise. He turned on the lights, picked up the same worn tools he had used most of his life. Then he began taking another tractor apart, slowly, carefully, boit by boit, cover by cover, gear by gear. Nothing was removed randomly. Harold inspected each piece before setting it aside. Some went onto shelves, some into labeled bins. Some were wrapped in brown paper and marked by hand. Hours could pass without him speaking. To anyone standing in the doorway, the workshop looked crowded with useless metal. To Harold, it did not look crowded at all. It looked organized, intentionnel, almost like a library. Margaret, his wife, noticed it before anyone else. One afternoon she carried coffee into the shop and looked at the shelves lining the walls. "You know," she said, "most people collect things they want to keep." Harold wiped grease from his hands. "I'm not collecting tractors." Margaret glanced toward the yard. There were more than 20 of them waiting outside. "Then what are you collecting?" Harold looked past her at the machines. For a moment, he did not answer, because he had begun to understand something the people at the auctions had not. A tractor could stop running and still contain something valuable. Sometimes, many valuable things. The machine everyone laughed at that morning would never work a field again. Harold already knew that. But he had not bought it because he believed it could be saved. He had bought it because he knew how to look inside what everyone else had already thrown away. And somewhere beneath the rust was the beginning of a business nobody in town could see yet. Long before people laughed at Harold Turner for buying dead tractors, they called him for a very different reason. When a machine failed, and no one else could figure out why, farmers called Harold. For 43 years, he worked as a farm equipment mechanic across 3 counties. He never owned a dealership, never had his name painted on a building, never appeared in a magazine. But during planting and harvest, his phone could ring before sunrise and long after dark. A tractor would die halfway through a field. A combine would refuse to start with rain coming. A hydraulic system would lose pressure when a farmer could least afford to stop. Someone would look at the machine, look at the sky, and say, "Call Harold." What made him valuable was not speed. It was the way he looked at things. Harold rarely began by replacing parts. First, he listened. An uneven knock, a bearing that changed pitch under load, a pump that sounded normal until the oil warmed. Then he looked. Wear marks on a shaft, metal dust in the bottom of a housing, a crack so thin it disappeared unless the light hit it correctly. Younger mechanics sometimes asked how he knew where to start. Harold usually gave the same answer. "Machines tell you what happened." Then he would smile. "You just have to stop long enough to listen." By the time Harold entered his 60s, the machines around him were changing. New tractors arrived with electronic controls, sensors, sealed components, diagnostic computers, and systems that often required dealership equipment to service. Harold did not hate the new technology. He understood why farming was changing, but he also noticed something happening far beyond the dealership floor. The old tractors were not disappearing. Farmers kept using them. Machines built in the 1970s still pulled hay equipment. Tractors from the 1980s still planted fields. Some had faded paint and patched seats, but they started every morning and had been paid for decades earlier. Their owners knew them. Their mechanics understood them. And when something broke, many could still be repaired with ordinary tools. The machines themselves were surviving. Something else was disappearing. Harold began noticing it in parts catalogs. A component that had once been listed suddenly carried a different note. No longer available. Then another, and another. A farmer would call needing one small piece to return an otherwise working tractor to the field. A steering component, a gear, a hydraulic control, a housing. Nothing dramatic. Just one piece of metal. But without it, thousands of pounds of machinery could become useless. Harold started keeping things other mechanics threw away. If an engine was destroyed but the transmission was still good, he noticed. If a tractor had been damaged in an accident but its hydraulic system survived, he noticed that too. He saved brackets, shafts, housings, gears. Not because he had a business plan. Throwing away something usable simply bothered him. After 43 years, Harold retired at 65. His co-workers gave him a plaque. There was barbecue behind the shop. People shook his hand and told him he had earned some rest. Margaret agreed. "No more calls at 5 in the morning," she told him. Harold thought that sounded wonderful. For about 3 weeks. Then the silence became strange. He still woke before sunrise. He sharpened tools that did not need sharpening. Reorganized drawers he had already organized. Some mornings he walked into the garage, stood there for several minutes, then went back inside. He missed the work. More than that, he missed being useful. One Saturday, Harold drove to a farm auction just to get out of the house. Near the end of the sale, an old tractor came across the lot. Its engine block was cracked. The tires were worn. The paint had almost disappeared. The auctioneer asked for a bid. No one moved. Harold recognized the model immediately. He had repaired dozens like it. He walked around the machine once, then stopped. The tractor itself was finished, but not everything inside it was. Harold raised his hand. He bought it for almost nothing. That evening, Margaret stepped outside as he backed the trailer beside the workshop. She stared at the broken tractor, then at Harold. "So this is retirement?" Harold climbed out of the truck. He looked at the machine for a long moment. Most people would have seen a tractor that had reached the end of its life. Harold saw something else. He just did not know yet how much it was worth. "I don't think I bought a tractor," he said. Margaret folded her arms. "What did you buy?" Harold looked toward the workshop. Then, back at the rusted machine. "Give me a few days." And for nearly 2 weeks, the tractor sat untouched, waiting for Harold to prove that a machine could be dead without being worthless. The first tractor Harold bought after retirement sat untouched for nearly 2 weeks. To the neighbors, it looked abandoned all over again. To Harold, it was waiting. On the 15th morning, he rolled it into the workshop, closed the doors, turned on the old radio, and began removing the hood. The engine block was cracked beyond repair. The radiator had corroded through. The tires were dry-rotted. The wiring had been chewed apart by rodents years earlier. By every conventional measure, the tractor was finished. But Harold had never judged a machine by whether it could start. He judged it by what remained. He removed the hydraulic pump first, then the steering box, then the PTO assembly, then the transmission housing. Hours passed in complete silence, except for the sound of metal tools against older metal. When he finally finished, the tractor looked less like a machine and more like a skeleton. Most people would have seen destruction. Harold saw inventory. He cleaned each part carefully with solvent and compressed air, inspected it for wear, wrapped it in brown paper, wrote the part number by hand, and placed it on a wooden shelf. By sunset, one rusted tractor had become dozens of usable components. The next week, he bought another, then another. Within a few months, shelves began covering the walls of his workshop. Margaret walked in one afternoon carrying a cup of coffee and stopped in the doorway. Every shelf was labeled. Every section was organized by manufacturer, model year, and assembly type. Hydraulic components occupied one wall, transmissions another, steering systems another. Electrical components were stored separately. Bolts and brackets were sorted into hundreds of small bins. It no longer looked like a junk collection. It looked like an archive. "You've turned the garage into a parts library," she said. Harold nodded. "That's exactly what it is." What Margaret did not yet understand was that Harold had spent 40 years watching something disappear. During his career, manufacturers gradually stopped producing thousands of replacement parts for older tractors. A gear that had once been available in every dealership, a steering shaft produced for only 8 years, a hydraulic valve used in a single generation of machines. When production ended, farmers had only 3 options: find old dealership stock, pay collectors' prices, or salvage the part from another tractor. Most people believed an old tractor lost value with age. Harold knew that was often backwards. A running tractor might be worth a few $1,000s, but a tractor that could no longer be repaired might contain 20, 30, or even 50 individual parts that had become scarce enough to command surprisingly high prices. One afternoon, while sorting components from a worn-out 1978 utility tractor, Harold received a phone call from a farmer he had known for years. "Harold," the man said, "I'm looking for a hydraulic lift control valve. The dealer says they discontinued it years ago." Harold looked across the workshop. "Third shelf, left side, second bin from the bottom. I think I have one." The farmer drove over that evening. Harold handed him the valve. The man stared at it for a long moment. "I've been searching for this for 6 months," he said quietly. "How much do you want for it?" Harold shrugged. $50. The farmer reached into his truck and handed him the money without hesitation. After he left, Harold stood alone in the workshop. That valve had come from a tractor he had purchased for $200. One part had recovered a quarter of the entire purchase price. A week later, another farmer needed a steering gearbox, then a PTO shaft, then a transmission gear, then a fuel injection pump. The calls kept coming. Harold had not advertised. He had not started a business. He had simply become the person who remembered where forgotten things were stored. The realization arrived slowly. He was not collecting old tractors. He was preserving a supply chain that had quietly vanished. Every discontinued part represented a farmer trying to keep an older machine alive. Every rusted tractor represented a warehouse that no longer existed. One evening, Harold spread several parts catalogs across his workbench. He compared current dealership inventories with the machines sitting behind his workshop. Page after page contained the same phrase, "No longer available." He circled each discontinued component, then walked outside with a flashlight. The tractors looked different now, not as broken equipment, as rows of unopened warehouses. Each machine contained hundreds of components, some common, some worthless, but a few had become almost impossible to find. The rust was hiding scarcity, and scarcity, Harold knew better than most people, had a way of creating value. The next morning he drove farther than usual, not to buy a better tractor, to find a rarer one, because for the first time since retiring, Harold was beginning to suspect that his strange little hobby was not about keeping busy anymore. It was about discovering a market that had been quietly waiting inside rust for decades. Long before people laughed at Harold Turner for buying dead tractors, they called him for a very different reason. When a machine failed, and no one else could figure out why, farmers called Harold. For 43 years, he worked as a farm equipment mechanic across 3 counties. He never owned a dealership, never had his name painted on a building, never appeared in a magazine. But during planting and harvest, his phone could ring before sunrise and long after dark. A tractor would die halfway through a field. A combine would refuse to start with rain coming. A hydraulic system would lose pressure when a farmer could least afford to stop. Someone would look at the machine, look at the sky, and say, "Call Harold." What made him valuable was not speed. It was the way he looked at things. Harold rarely began by replacing parts. First, he listened. An uneven knock, a bearing that changed pitch under load, a pump that sounded normal until the oil warmed. Then he looked. Where marks on a shaft, metal dust in the bottom of a housing, a crack so thin it disappeared unless the light hit it correctly. Younger mechanics sometimes asked how he knew where to start. Harold usually gave the same answer. "Machines tell you what happened." Then he would smile. "You just have to stop long enough to listen." By the time Harold entered his 60s, the machines around him were changing. New tractors arrived with electronic controls, sensors, sealed components, diagnostic computers, and systems that often required dealership equipment to service. Harold did not hate the new technology. He understood why farming was changing, but he also noticed something happening far beyond the dealership floor. The old tractors were not disappearing. Farmers kept using them. Machines built in the 1970s still pulled hay equipment. Tractors from the 1980s still planted fields. Some had faded paint and patched seats. But they started every morning and had been paid for decades earlier. Their owners knew them. Their mechanics understood them. And when something broke, many could still be repaired with ordinary tools. The machines themselves were surviving. Something else was disappearing. Harold began noticing it in parts catalogs. A component that had once been listed suddenly carried a different note, "No longer available." Then another, and another. A farmer would call needing one small piece to return an otherwise working tractor to the field. A steering component, a gear, a hydraulic control, a housing. Nothing dramatic, just one piece of metal, but without it, thousands of pounds of machinery could become useless. Harold started keeping things other mechanics threw away. If an engine was destroyed, but the transmission was still good, he noticed. If a tractor had been damaged in an accident but its hydraulic system survived, he noticed that too. He saved brackets, shafts, housings, gears, not because he had a business plan. Throwing away something usable simply bothered him. After 43 years, Harold retired at 65. His co-workers gave him a plaque. There was barbecue behind the shop. People shook his hand and told him he had earned some rest. Margaret agreed. No more calls at 5 in the morning. She told him. Harold thought that sounded wonderful. For about 3 weeks. Then the silence became strange. He still woke before sunrise. He sharpened tools that did not need sharpening. Reorganized drawers he had already organized. Some mornings he walked into the garage, stood there for several minutes, then went back inside. He missed the work. More than that, he missed being useful. One Saturday, Harold drove to a farm auction just to get out of the house. Near the end of the sale, an old tractor came across the lot. Its engine block was cracked. The tires were worn. The paint had almost disappeared. The auctioneer asked for a bid. No one moved. Harold recognized the model immediately. He had repaired dozens like it. He walked around the machine once, then stopped. The tractor itself was finished, but not everything inside it was. Harold raised his hand. He bought it for almost nothing. That evening, Margaret stepped outside as he backed the trailer beside the workshop. She stared at the broken tractor, then at Harold. So this is retirement? Harold climbed out of the truck. He looked at the machine for a long moment. Most people would have seen a tractor that had reached the end of its life. Harold saw something else. He just did not know yet how much it was worth. I don't think I bought a tractor, he said. Margaret folded her arms. What did you buy? Harold looked toward the workshop, then back at the rusted machine. Give me a few days. And for nearly 2 weeks, the tractor sat untouched, waiting for Harold to prove that a machine could be dead, without being worthless. The first delivery driver who came to Harold's property nearly turned around. The address led him down a narrow county road, past cornfields and weathered barns, to what looked from the distance like a retired mechanic's home surrounded by dead tractors. He checked the shipping order again. Secret, 3 states. He pulled into the driveway and found Harold standing beside a pallet with a clipboard in his hand. The driver looked past him. Rows of shelves were visible through the open workshop doors. Boxes were stacked by size. Heavy castings sat on reinforced benches. Every shelf carried handwritten labels. Is this the business? The driver asked. Harold glanced toward the buildings. I guess it is now. The strange part was that Harold had never decided to build a warehouse. It had happened one shelf at a time. At first, he could remember everything. A steering box from a 1976 tractor, a hydraulic valve from a machine bought outside Mason County, a transmission gear from the burned tractor behind Miller's barn. Harold remembered the machines, the way other people remembered faces. But the calls kept coming. So did the tractors. And soon, memory was no longer enough. The original workshop filled first. Then Harold added shelves along the back wall. Then another row. Then a small storage shed. Then another building. The tractors outside slowly disappeared as Harold dismantled them. In their place grew something far more useful. Inventory. But Harold quickly discovered that owning a rare part and being able to sell it were 2 different things. A hydraulic housing buried beneath 50 other housings might as well not exist. A gearbox without a model number was simply heavy metal. A rare casting stored in the wrong building could turn a 10-minute order into an afternoon search. The real value was not just having the part, it was knowing exactly what it was. And exactly where it was. Harold developed a system. Every tractor received an identification number before the first bolt came loose. He recorded the manufacturer, model, serial number, year. When he could confirm it, he wrote down where the tractor came from and photographed it before disassembly. Then the machine entered the workshop. Components came off in sequence. Engines in one area, transmission assemblies in another, hydraulics, steering, fuel systems, electrical components, wheels and hubs, smaller brackets, shafts, levers, and linkages went into labeled bins. Harold cleaned each usable component before storing it. Grease came off. Dirt came off. Rust was inspected rather than ignored. Casting numbers were recorded. Damage was noted. If Harold was not confident, a part could be used again. It did not go onto a sales shelf. Margaret began helping with the paperwork. At first, she wrote invoices at the kitchen table. Before long, the table disappeared beneath shipping labels, catalogs, handwritten inventory cards, and stacks of envelopes. One evening, she held up a card covered in Harold's cramped handwriting. You realize no one else can read this? I can. That is not a system. Harold looked at her. Margaret pointed toward the workshop. What happens if someone needs something and you're not here? Harold did not answer. He had spent his entire career being the person who knew. Now the business was becoming too large to depend on one person knowing everything. That became clear when a mechanic from another county arrived, carrying a broken transmission gear wrapped in an oily shop towel. "I've called 5 dealerships." The man said, "2 salvage yards too." He placed the gear on Harold's workbench. "If you have one of these, I'll buy it today." Harold picked it up, turned it once, studied the teeth, then walked directly into the storage building. The mechanic followed. Harold moved past 2 aisles, stopped at a shelf, reached behind a larger gear, and pulled out what appeared to be an identical part. The mechanic stared. "You didn't even look anything up." Harold smiled. "I remember the tractor." The mechanic laughed. "That's impressive." Harold looked at the shelves around him. Thousands of pounds of steel, hundreds of components, more arriving every week. For the first time, the compliment made him uneasy. Remembering everything was impressive, depending on it was dangerous. That night, Harold opened a fresh ledger. He began creating location codes: building, row, shelf, bin. A steering component was no longer simply somewhere in the back building. It became B32. A hydraulic valve became A57. Every inventory card connected a part to a location and to the tractor it had come from. The change seemed small. It was not. Orders became faster. Parts stopped disappearing into shelves. Margaret could find items without Harold standing beside her. For the first time, the operation could function outside his memory. Then Harold began studying the numbers. A tractor purchased for $300 produced nearly $2,000 in sales. Another bought for $500 returned several times that amount across dozens of components. Others barely paid for themselves. That taught him another lesson. Rust alone did not create value. Scarcity did. Identification did. Condition did. An organization turned all 3 into something a customer could actually buy. Harold stopped thinking like a man dismantling old tractors. He began thinking like an inventory manager. Each new machine was evaluated before purchase. What components did it contain? Which ones had customers requested? Which parts were common? Which were becoming difficult to replace? How much space would the machine consume? How long might the useful parts sit before someone needed them? The questions changed his buying decisions. So did the property. Pallet racks replaced makeshift shelves. A shipping table appeared near the front door. Heavy components were stored low. Small, valuable pieces were labeled and separated. Nothing useful was thrown away simply because it looked insignificant. Harold had learned that sometimes the smallest part could stop the largest machine. One afternoon, a driver arrived to collect another shipment. He looked around at the organized aisles and rows of tagged components. "What exactly do you sell here?" Harold almost said tractor parts. But that was no longer quite right. He thought about Ben driving through the night, the mechanics carrying broken gears into his shop. The farmers calling after dealerships had already told them no. "Finally," Harold said, "things people can't find anymore." The driver nodded. "That sounds like a pretty good business." After he left, Harold stood alone in the aisle. For years, he had believed his advantage was knowing machines. Now he understood that knowledge had to become a system, because a rare part hidden in a pile of scrap was almost worthless. A rare part cleaned, identified, documented, and located in seconds was something else entirely. It was inventory, and Harold was beginning to have more of it than one man could safely keep inside his head. The part that almost ruined Harold's reputation was smaller than a loaf of bread. It was a transmission synchronizer assembly from an older utility tractor, a component that had become difficult to find after the manufacturer discontinued the model years earlier. A farmer from Missouri had called in desperation during planting season, and Harold was almost certain he had exactly what the man needed. He walked through the warehouse, checked the shelf, compared the casting number, packed the part carefully, and shipped it overnight. 2 days later, the phone rang. "It doesn't fit." Harold felt a heaviness in his chest. He had not felt in years. The part looked identical. The casting number was nearly identical, but the manufacturer had made a small internal revision late in production, changing a dimension by less than 1/4 of an inch. The synchronizer would not seat properly. The farmer had already lost 2 days waiting for the shipment. Harold refunded the money immediately and paid for return shipping himself. The farmer was understanding. Harold was not. That night, he walked through every aisle of the warehouse with a flashlight and realized something uncomfortable. His memory was no longer enough. For decades, he had relied on experience, instinct, and the ability to remember where things came from. That system worked when he serviced dozens of tractors. It was beginning to fail now that he possessed thousands of parts. The mistake exposed a larger problem. Many tractor components looked almost identical while belonging to different production runs. A hydraulic valve from 1976 could differ subtly from one made in 1978. A steering box might fit one engine configuration but not another. A transmission housing could vary depending on axle type or factory location. The differences were often invisible until installation. Harold spent the next week pulling parts from shelves and checking them against old service manuals. He drove to libraries. He visited retired dealership managers. He bought outdated parts catalogs that younger mechanics considered obsolete. His workbench disappeared beneath stacks of manuals, exploded diagrams, engineering bulletins, and handwritten compatibility notes. Margaret watched him working past midnight and asked, "You're treating this like a factory?" Harold looked up from a catalog. "No," he said quietly. "I'm treating it like someone else's planting season." That sentence changed the way they approached the business. They began creating detailed inventory cards. Each part was linked to serial number ranges, production years, and compatible tractor models. Components were photographed from multiple angles. Measurements were recorded. Known revisions were noted in the margins. If there was uncertainty, the part was marked and separated rather than sold. The process was slow, painfully slow. For every hour spent dismantling tractors, Harold now spent another hour documenting them. At times, he wondered whether the extra work was worth it. Then another problem arrived. A severe summer storm tore through the county one evening. Rain leaked through the roof of one storage building. Several shelves collapsed under the weight of heavy cast iron components. Boxes of smaller parts were soaked. Labels smeared. Handwritten inventory sheets warped beyond recognition. By morning, dozens of components had lost their identification. Harold stood in ankle-deep water, staring at shelves he had built with his own hands. For the first time since retirement, he considered stopping. The business had grown larger than he had intended, larger than he had planned, larger than one retired mechanic could easily manage. That afternoon, Margaret walked into the damaged building carrying a stack of clean notebooks and a box of waterproof labels. She set them on the workbench. "We're rebuilding it," she said. Harold looked around the warehouse. Bent shelves, scattered parts, mud on the concrete floor. "We'll lose weeks. Then we'll lose weeks," she replied. "But we're not losing the system." The word stayed with him. System. Not inventory. Not parts. Not tractors. System. Over the next month, they rebuilt everything. Shelving was reinforced. Parts were elevated off the floor. Labels were replaced with weather-resistant tags. Inventory records were duplicated. Margaret convinced Harold to keep both paper records and digital backups. He resisted computers for years. Now he began entering every part into a searchable database. The work was exhausting, but something unexpected happened. The warehouse became faster, more accurate, more reliable. What had begun as a mechanic's memory was becoming a professional operation. The failure had cost money. It had cost time. It had cost pride. But it had also forced Harold to build the one thing that separated a hobby from a company, a repeatable system. Months later, when another farmer called needing a nearly identical transmission component, Harold did not trust his memory. He trusted the records. He verified the serial number range, confirmed the production revision, compared photographs, checked measurements. Only then did he ship the part. When the farmer called back, he said only one sentence. It fit perfectly. Harold smiled. The warehouse had survived. More importantly, it had learned. And that lesson would become the foundation for everything that followed. Harold trusted steel. He trusted gears, bearings, casting numbers stamped into metal decades earlier. The internet was different. It seemed invisible, temporary, unreliable. He often joked that a wrench never needed an update. For years, almost every order still began the same way. The phone rang. Harold answered. What model? What year? Serial number? What exactly failed? Then he checked the records. Walked into the warehouse. Found the component and prepared it for shipment. The system worked. Until the phone became the problem. Some days, Harold barely left his desk. Farmers called with clear part numbers. Others did not. It's the gear behind the other gear. The cast piece under the left side. The lever near the hydraulic control. Harold might spend 30 minutes helping someone identify a component before discovering he did not have it. Another caller might need him to explain the difference between two nearly identical production revisions. He liked helping, but every hour on the phone was an hour he was not buying tractors, checking inventory, dismantling machines, or preparing shipments. The business had solved one problem, finding rare part. Now it had created another. Too many people needed Harold himself. His granddaughter Emily noticed it during a weekend visit. She was studying business in college and had grown up watching her grandfather disappear into workshops filled with grease, manuals, and old machinery. That Saturday, she watched him answer calls for nearly 3 hours. When the phone finally stopped ringing, Emily looked around the warehouse. Rows of labeled components stretched behind him. Photographs, inventory records, compatibility notes, measurements. Everything a customer needed was already there. Except the customer could not see it. "Grandpa," she asked, "why isn't this online?" Harold frowned. "Why would it be? So people can find the parts themselves. They'll call. They already are." Harold pointed toward the phone. "That's the problem." Emily smiled. "That's my point." He shook his head. Farmers wanted to talk to someone who understood the machine. They wanted reassurance before paying for a 40-year-old component. A website could not crawl under a tractor. A website could not listen to an engine. A website could not tell whether a customer had read the serial plate correctly. Emily picked up one of Harold's inventory cards. "Then don't replace the advice." She held it up. "Put the advice where people can see it before they call." The next morning, she returned with a camera, a laptop, and a notebook. Harold remained skeptical, but he agreed to try. They began with a few dozen parts. A hydraulic pump was placed on a clean table. Emily photographed it from several angles. Harold read the casting number. She entered it. Manufacturer, model, compatible serial range, condition, measurements, storage location. Then Harold added something Emily had not asked for. How to tell it apart from the earlier version. She typed that too. They repeated the process. Steering assemblies, PTO components, transmission gears, hydraulic valves, housings, hoops, small brackets that looked insignificant until someone needed the exact one. The work took days, then weeks. What had once existed inside Harold's head? Notebooks and filing boxes began appearing on a screen. The website went live quietly. Harold expected almost nothing. 3 days later, Emily walked into the workshop. "You got an order." "From where?" "Pennsylvania." Harold looked surprised. A week later came Texas, then Oregon, then Saskatchewan. One morning, Emily handed him a shipping form. Harold read the address twice. "Australia?" Emily nodded. He looked at the component waiting on the shipping table. It was not especially large, not especially beautiful. A part most people at an auction would have walked past without noticing. How did someone in Australia find this? Emily smiled. "They weren't looking for you." Harold waited. "They were looking for the part." That was when the scale of what they had built finally changed. Until then, Harold had thought geographically. A farmer in the next county, a repair shop, 2 states away, someone willing to drive overnight. The internet did not care how far away the customer was. If someone typed the right model number, casting number, or component description, Harold's shelf could appear in front of them. Orders began arriving while he slept. Emails waited in the morning. Collectors searched for rare castings. Repair shops looked for discontinued assemblies. Agricultural schools searched for components for older training equipment. Mechanics used Harold's photographs to confirm production revisions. The phone still rang, but the conversations changed. "I found item HT 2746. I saw the measurements on your site. My serial number falls inside the range you listed." Instead of starting from zero, customers arrived already knowing more. That saved time, and time allowed the business to grow. Emily expanded the listings. Inventory became searchable by manufacturer and model. She added serial number references, compatibility notes, photographs of distinguishing features. Short explanations showed customers how to tell two similar components apart. Harold began to understand what she had really done. She had not simply put parts online. She had made his knowledge searchable. Soon the warehouse changed again. More shipping tables appeared. Boxes arrived by the hundreds. Freight pickups became regular instead of occasional. Heavy components were strapped to pallets. Smaller parts moved through packing stations. The workload became too much for Harold and Margaret alone. Harold hired Lucas, a young mechanic, to help dismantle tractors, clean components, and prepare orders. For the first time, Harold was no longer just repairing, sorting, and selling. He was managing. One afternoon, Lucas stood beside a pallet of outgoing parts. Labels pointed in different directions. Iowa, Georgia, Alberta, Texas, Pennsylvania. He looked toward Harold. How many old tractors are still running out there? Harold glanced at the orders. More than anybody thinks. The website was beginning to prove it. One rare transmission housing might attract only a few searches in one state. A steering pedestal might be needed by only one mechanic in another. A hydraulic control assembly might sit untouched for months before a farmer thousands of miles away suddenly searched for it. Individually, those customers looked insignificant. Together, they were something else. A market. The internet had not created the scarcity. It had not made old tractors valuable. It had not put useful components inside rusted machines. All of that already existed. What the internet changed was visibility. For years, Harold had been building shelves full of answers. Now people who had never heard his name could finally ask the right question and find one. One evening, Margaret watched another freight truck leave the property. She smiled. "You were supposed to slow down after retirement?" Harold looked across the warehouse. Employees were packing orders. Emily was updating listings. Lucas was unloading another tractor. He laughed. "I think retirement got away from me." But something more important had changed. The little operation hidden behind Harold's house was no longer limited by county lines. Word of mouth, or how many calls one retired mechanic could answer in a day. The world could finally see the inventory. And once it could see it, one question became impossible to ignore. Why were so many people still searching for parts from machines everyone else considered obsolete? The question Harold heard more often now was simple. Why would anyone pay that much for an old tractor part? To someone outside farming, the answer was hard to understand. A greasy gearbox looked obsolete. A 40-year-old hydraulic pump looked like scrap. A rusted housing looked like something that should have been melted down years ago. But the farmers buying them were not paying for old metal. They were paying to keep a machine they already owned. One winter afternoon, a young agricultural journalist visited Harold's warehouse. She walked past rows of transmissions, pumps, steering assemblies, and castings before stopping beside the workbench. So what are people really buying here? Harold picked up a hydraulic pump. This came from a tractor built in the 70s. He set it down. The tractor that needs it is still working. The reporter nodded. So the farmer doesn't want a new tractor? Harold smiled. He already has a tractor. That was the part outsiders missed. Farm equipment did not always disappear just because a newer model existed. If a machine still started, pulled, lifted, and earned its keep, many owners saw no reason to replace it. The problem came later. Manufacturers moved forward. New models replaced old ones. Production lines changed. Suppliers changed. Tooling disappeared. Warehouses made room for newer inventory. A component that had once been ordinary slowly became difficult to find. Then one day, it became unavailable. That evening, Harold spread old parts catalogs across a table with Emily. He opened one from decades earlier. "See this PTO assembly?" Emily nodded. Back then, any dealer could order it. He opened a newer catalog. Beside the same number were 3 words. No longer available. He turned another page. Hydraulic valve. Unavailable. Steering component. Unavailable. Transmission gear. Unavailable. The pattern was everywhere. Emily looked across the table. So they just stopped supporting the tractors? Harold shook his head. It's not that simple. He understood the economics. A manufacturer could not keep producing every component forever. As older machines became fewer, demand for any single part became too small to justify tooling. Suppliers, storage, and production. The companies had not abandoned farmers. They had abandoned volume. That distinction explained Harold's entire business. The manufacturers worked where demand was large enough to justify production. Harold worked where demand had become too small for factories, but was still urgent for the person whose tractor had stopped. One farmer might need a gearbox in Kansas. Another might need the same one 2 years later in Nebraska. A third might search for it from Canada. Individually, none of them represented enough demand for a manufacturer to restart a production line. Together, they created a market for someone willing to preserve what already existed. Harold had become that someone. He was not competing with the companies that built tractors. He was operating in the space they had left behind. The reporter looked around the warehouse again. So all these broken tractors outside? Harold waited. They're replacing factories that no longer make the parts? Harold smiled. Now you're seeing it. The rusted machines were no longer just inventory. They were a decentralized supply chain. Every tractor Harold saved contained pieces of a manufacturing system that no longer existed. And suddenly the strange little business behind his house made perfect sense. Harold had not discovered a new product. He had discovered what happened when an old product outlived the system built to support it. But finding the gap was only half the problem. If farmers were going to depend on 40-year-old parts during planting and harvest, Harold had to prove something more important than availability. He had to prove those parts could still be trusted. For the first few years, Harold's business was simple. A farmer called. He found the part. He shipped it. If the part worked, everyone was happy. If it didn't, he fixed the mistake. But as orders increased, Harold noticed something that bothered him. Too many customers were asking the same question. Has this part been tested? He would answer honestly. It came from a running tractor. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. One afternoon, a restoration shop in Ohio ordered a hydraulic pump from a tractor that had been dismantled nearly 2 years earlier. Harold shipped it carefully, confident it had been working when removed. A week later, the customer called. The pump functioned, but one internal seal had hardened during storage, causing pressure to drop under load. The customer was polite. Harold was disappointed. He refunded the purchase, shipped another pump, and paid the freight himself. That evening he walked through the warehouse and looked at the shelves differently. He realized he was still thinking like a mechanic. The customer was thinking like a farmer. A farmer did not care whether a part had once worked. He cared whether it would work now. That distinction changed everything. The next morning, Harold pulled every hydraulic component from storage: pumps, valves, cylinders, control assemblies. He built a small testing station using pressure gauges, hydraulic lines, and an electric motor salvaged from old shop equipment. Each pump was connected, pressurized, measured. If it passed, it received a green inspection tag. If it failed, it was rebuilt when possible. If rebuilding was impossible, it was stripped for usable internal components. The process spread to other systems. Steering boxes were inspected for play. Bearings were measured. Gears were checked for pitting and wear. Electrical components were bench tested. Fuel pumps were evaluated. Starter motors and alternators were rebuilt instead of merely cleaned. Lucas watched Harold spend nearly an hour inspecting a component that could have been sold immediately. We could move inventory faster, Lucas said. Harold nodded. We could. So why don't we? Harold placed the inspected part onto the shelf. Because I'm not trying to sell parts. Lucas looked puzzled. Harold continued. I'm trying to make sure the phone doesn't ring tomorrow with a problem. That philosophy quietly became the company's identity. Customers began noticing. Parts arrived cleaner than expected. Bolts were included. Gaskets were labeled. Installation notes were tucked into boxes. Compatible model ranges were clearly marked. If Harold knew a common failure point, he wrote it on a small card and included it with the shipment. Sometimes he added a handwritten note. Check the input shaft bearing while the housing is off. Replace the seal before installation. This casting fits only after serial number 1456220. The notes took only minutes, but customers remembered them. Word spread through restoration forums and farming communities. Harold doesn't just send parts. He tells you how to keep the tractor alive. The business began attracting a different kind of customer. Not only farmers trying to finish a harvest, collectors restoring family tractors, agricultural museums, vocational schools teaching older equipment repair, independent mechanics specializing in vintage farm machinery. They were willing to pay more for a component that had been inspected, documented, and supported by someone who actually understood it. Harold was no longer competing on price. He was competing on confidence. One afternoon, a large agricultural equipment reseller contacted him with an unusual proposal. They wanted to buy several hundred parts in bulk. Harold asked for the list. He recognized many of the items immediately. Common components, mixed conditions, no testing required, no documentation needed. The order would have been worth more money than he had ever received from a single customer. Margaret found him sitting at the kitchen table with the proposal. "Well?" she asked. Harold folded the paper. "I'm going to say no." She looked surprised. "It's a lot of money." "I know." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because they're buying inventory." He looked toward the warehouse. "I'm building trust." He declined the offer. Instead, he invested in better shelving, restoration tools, measuring equipment, and a dedicated cleaning area. He hired another employee, then another, one specialized in dismantling tractors, another in inventory management. Emily expanded the website again, adding inspection status, restoration level, and detailed photographs for every major component. Customers could now see exactly what they were buying before placing an order. Returns dropped dramatically. Repeat customers increased. Repair shops began ordering from Harold almost automatically whenever they encountered an older tractor. One restoration business in Wisconsin told him, "When we see your inspection tag, we stop worrying." That sentence meant more to Harold than the invoice. Years later, a business consultant visiting the warehouse asked what had made the company successful. Harold did not mention the internet. He did not mention inventory. He did not mention discontinued parts. He simply held up a rebuilt hydraulic pump. "Anyone can sell a used part," he said. "The hard part is selling a used part that someone is willing to depend on." That was the difference. Harold had stopped selling rust. He had stopped selling scrap. He had even stopped selling tractor parts. He was selling reliability. He was selling confidence. He was selling the promise that an old machine could still earn another season. And once customers began trusting that promise, the business no longer grew one part at a time. It grew one relationship at a time. The warehouse had become something far more valuable than a collection of discontinued components. It had become a place where forgotten machines found a second life, and where a retired mechanic discovered that the most profitable thing he could restore was not the tractor itself. It was people's faith that it could still work. The banker looked at Harold's tax returns twice before speaking. "There has to be a mistake," he said. Harold smiled politely. "There usually isn't." The banker adjusted his glasses and looked down again. "You're telling me this revenue came from used tractor parts?" "Yes." "From tractors that were mostly purchased as scrap?" "Yes." The room fell silent. For decades, Harold had been the man people pitied for filling his property with rusted machinery. Now he was sitting across from a commercial lender who could not understand how a retired mechanic had quietly built a company, generating more revenue than several businesses in town. The truth was that it had not happened all at once. There had been no viral moment, no television appearance, no sudden invention. The business had grown, one discontinued part at a time, one satisfied customer at a time, one tractor that everyone else ignored at a time. What finally changed was scale. By his 10th year in retirement, Harold was purchasing tractors across multiple states. Auctioneers began calling him directly before sales. Farm liquidation companies added his name to their contact lists. Rural equipment dealers offered him abandoned inventory that had been sitting behind their buildings for years. People no longer asked why he wanted broken tractors. They asked how many he could take. The warehouse expanded again. Then again. The original workshop remained at the center of the property, but new metal buildings appeared around it like spokes on a wheel. One building held engines and major driveline components. Another housed hydraulic systems. Another contained electrical and fuel components. A climate-controlled section was built for rebuilt pumps, restored carburetors, precision gears, and rare castings that had become too valuable to store in ordinary conditions. Forklifts replaced handcarts. Pallet racks rose toward the ceiling. Inventory scanners appeared beside the old handwritten notebooks that Harold still refused to throw away. Lucas managed receiving. Emily oversaw online operations. Margaret coordinated accounting and customer records. The retired mechanic who had once worked alone with a wrench and a flashlight was now leading a team. One afternoon, Emily walked into the office carrying a spreadsheet. "Grandpa," she said, "I think you should look at this." Harold glanced up. "What is it?" "Our top-selling parts over the last 12 months. She placed the printout on the desk. Hydraulic pumps, PTO assemblies, transmission gears, steering gearboxes, final drive components, engine heads. The numbers surprised even him. Some individual part categories had generated more revenue than entire tractor sales used to bring in. Emily pointed to another column. "These came from tractors you bought for less than $500. Harold leaned back in his chair. A machine that had been considered worthless had produced dozens of parts, each solving a different problem for a different customer. The tractor had not been a product. It had been a supply chain. As the business grew, something unexpected happened. Harold became known among auctioneers as the man who could assign value to machines no one else wanted. Bidders focused on horsepower, appearance, and whether an engine could start. Harold focused on casting numbers, production years, and discontinued assemblies. A burned tractor with an intact transmission, a flood-damaged tractor with salvageable hydraulics, a machine with a destroyed engine but a rare final drive housing. He often bought tractors that received no other bids. People still laugh sometimes. Old habits die slowly. But the laughter sounded different now. It carried curiosity instead of certainty. One auctioneer admitted, "Whenever Harold bids on something, I start wondering what I missed." The company crossed $1 million in annual revenue almost quietly. There was no celebration, no ribbon cutting, no champagne. Emily noticed it while preparing year-end financial reports. She walked into the warehouse where Harold was cleaning a steering assembly. "Grandpa," she said softly. He looked up. "We passed $1 million. He waited for a moment, then asked, "In Salis?" "Yes." He nodded once and returned to the steering assembly. Emily laughed. "That's it?" Harold smiled. "The tractors don't know." For him, the work had never been about becoming wealthy. It had always been about keeping useful things useful. But the financial success mattered for another reason. It proved that an entire market had been hiding in plain sight. A market created by discontinued manufacturing, aging farm equipment, and the practical determination of farmers who refused to replace machines that still had years of life left. Economists might have called it a niche aftermarket. Harold called it common sense. One evening, a television crew arrived to film a short documentary about rural entrepreneurship. The reporter stood in front of rows of carefully organized tractor parts and asked, "What's the secret?" Harold looked around the warehouse. Shelves filled with components rescued from machines everyone else had dismissed. Employees packaging orders for farms across the country. Forklifts moving inventory through buildings that had once been empty fields. He thought about the first tractor he had bought after retirement. The neighbors who called his property a junkyard. The banker who could not believe the numbers. The farmers who wrote letters saying one part had saved an entire season. Then he answered, "I never tried to build $1 million business." The reporter waited. "I just kept buying things people had stopped looking at." The camera crew was quiet for a moment, because everyone in the warehouse understood that the $1 million had not come from rust. It had come from seeing value before the rest of the market remembered it was there. The first man who came to Harold for advice was someone he remembered immediately, Bill Carson. Years earlier, Bill had stood at an auction laughing. while Harold bid on a tractor no one else wanted. "He's buying rust," Bill had said. Now Bill stood inside Harold's warehouse, holding a notebook. He looked down one aisle, then another. Cleaned components, inventory tags, testing records, parts waiting to ship across the country. Finally, he asked, "How do you know which tractors are worth buying?" Harold could have reminded him of the auction. He did not. "Come with me." They stopped beside an old transmission housing. This came from a tractor nobody wanted. Harold pointed to a hydraulic valve. Hard to replace. Then a steering assembly. Still useful if you know exactly what it fits. Bill listened. "So the tractor isn't what you're buying?" Harold smiled. "No. You're buying what's missing somewhere else." Harold nodded. Bill finally understood, and he was not the only one. Auctioneers who once joked about Harold's purchases began calling before estate sales. Repair shops asked whether he could locate discontinued components. Dealers wanted access to his inventory. People who had once seen a junkyard now saw a supply network. But the visitors Harold valued most were younger mechanics. Many were skilled with modern diagnostic systems, but had little experience with tractors built decades earlier. So on Saturdays, Harold began opening the workshop to them. No advertising, no tuition. He showed them how to read casting numbers, how to recognize production changes, how to measure wear, how to decide whether two parts that looked identical were actually interchangeable. One afternoon, Lucas watched a dozen mechanics gathered around Harold's workbench. "You know you're training competitors." Harold shook his head. "I'm training the people who'll keep these machines running after I'm gone." The room became quiet. Harold had spent a lifetime building knowledge that now gave his company an advantage. But he did not treat knowledge like inventory. He treated it like something useful, only if it kept moving. After one workshop, a young mechanic stayed behind. "My grandfather had a tractor like that," he said. "I never thought I'd learn how to repair one." Harold handed him an old service manual. "Take it." The mechanic hesitated. "These are hard to find." Harold smiled. "So are people willing to learn?" Years after the laughter began, Harold returned to the same auction yard. This time, bidders walked toward him before the auctioneer started. "What do you think of this model? Would you buy that one? Is there anything valuable left in it?" Harold answered every question patiently. Bill stood nearby. "I used to think you were buying junk." Harold looked toward another weathered tractor waiting at the edge of the lot. It was never junk. Bill waited. It was value nobody had identified yet. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Years earlier, people had laughed when Harold raised his hand. Now they watched to see what he would bid on next. Behind the newest warehouse, away from the shipping trucks and rows of organized inventory, one old tractor frame still sat beneath a tree. Most of it was gone. The hydraulic components had been removed years earlier. So had the starter, transmission par, PTO components, gauges, linkages. Anything Harold believed could work again had eventually found its way onto a shelf. What remained was little more than a rusted skeleton. Emily once asked why he had never sent it to the scrapyard. Harold rested one hand on the frame. "Because this is where I learned what I was really buying." It was the first tractor he had purchased after retirement. The machine everyone else had considered finished. Harold had paid almost nothing for it. Over time, pieces of that tractor had traveled farther than the machine itself ever had. One component kept a farmer working through hay season. Another went into a tractor hundreds of miles away. Others disappeared into workshops Harold would never see. The tractor had died once. Its parts had kept working for years. That was the idea hidden beneath everything Harold built. A machine could lose its usefulness as a whole without losing the usefulness of everything inside it. Most people judged the tractor at the wrong level. They saw one broken machine. Harold saw dozens of unfinished stories. And eventually, he realized the same principle explained the business itself. The valuable thing had never really been rusted steel. It was information. Knowing what a part was, knowing what it fit, knowing its condition, knowing where to find it, and knowing that somewhere, someone needed it badly enough to keep a machine working. Without that knowledge, a rare casting could sit in weeds for 30 years and remain scrap. With it, the same casting could save a farmer days of downtime. That difference built the warehouses, not luck, not rust. Recognition. One evening, Harold stood at the loading dock while the final truck of the day pulled away. The business had grown far beyond the little garage, where he once labeled parts by hand. Employees now handled inventory. Orders arrived from places he had never visited. Emily helped manage systems that Harold once insisted he would never need. Young mechanics came to learn what older generations had learned by touch, sound, and repetition. Margaret joined him outside. "Do you ever miss retirement?" Harold laughed. "I'm still waiting for it." They watched the truck disappear down the county road. For years, people had asked Harold how he turned old tractors into a $1 million business. The question always made him uncomfortable. He had never believed that was exactly what happened. He did not turn rust into money. He found useful things before other people stopped looking. The farmers understood that better than anyone. When a tractor failed during planting, the value of a replacement part was not measured only by what the metal was worth. It was measured by what could start moving again. A field, a harvest, a day of work, sometimes an entire season. Harold looked back at the old frame beneath the tree. Years earlier, men at an auction had laughed because they saw what the tractor had become. Harold had looked at the same machine and wondered what it could still do. That small difference had changed everything. The rust was real. So was the damage. So was everything that had been lost. Harold had never denied any of that. He had simply learned that the end of one use did not mean the end of all value. Sometimes value survived in pieces. Sometimes it survived in knowledge. Sometimes it waited quietly until the right person knew what to look for. The town had called Harold's property a tractor graveyard. They had been wrong. Graveyards were where useful things ended. Harold's place was where they started working again,